In 1969, I was a professor of philosophy at Columbia. I had two children of about 9 to 10 years of age. And there was a lot of disruption at the university and questions about whether the education of children was appropriate for their going on into college. I thought that it might be good if we could teach children some reasoning, such as the logic that I was teaching mainly to evening school students at the university. But I thought, well, that would just impose another dry, arid subject on these children if we taught them logic. So surely there must be some other way in which we can teach them reasoning without their disliking it so much. I talked this problem over with someone who said, well, why don't you write a story? And that struck me as very interesting, because children always pause for stories. And I thought, why not write a story of children learning to reason all by themselves without a teacher there to instruct them? And so I wrote what was later to become the book called Harry Stottlemyre's Discovery. I wrote a chapter. But when I was finished with that chapter, and I thought it was done with it, I realized that I needed more explanation. So I wrote a second chapter, and a third, and a fourth. And I thought they needed to discuss the aims of education among themselves. So I added a fifth. And critical thinking, and I added another one. And then I had the same children talking about science and art. So it became really very much like a college undergraduate course in philosophy. Then in 1974, Anne Sharp joined me, and we together formed the Institute for the Advancement of Philosophy for Children here at Montclair State College. I'd moved to Montclair State in the meantime. And we began to do a manual for Harry Stottlemyre, a teacher's manual. We began training teachers in the classrooms. We began inviting professors of philosophy and education from all over the country to come join us for a week or 2 weeks and discuss the matter of philosophy for children. And we began to see that this thing was beginning to take off. Any new program that comes down the road will have to deal with philosophy for children as a competitor, because it really, I think, presents a paradigm of excellent reasoning education. In other words, it stresses concept formation, it stresses reasoning, and it stresses the improvement of judgment. And I'm not sure there's any other program that can do that, just as I don't think there's any other subject that can do what philosophy does. Narrative plays a very important role in philosophy for children. First of all, because narrative plays a special role in the lives of children themselves. A narrative develops like a child. It almost thinks like a child because the author is thinking through the story, and we read his thinking as we read the page, his or her thinking. We're interested in how the child develops, how the child turns out. We're interested in how the narrative turns out. So there's a community of feeling. There's a rapprochement of relationships between stories and children. Now, the stories we use, like most stories, have characters in them, and the characters in every episode are children. I don't think in all the books there is an episode in which adults are shown talking without the presence of children. The children are always finding themselves faced with problems, but they're not fantastic problems. They're everyday problems, everyday difficulties. And the children discuss these problems and try to be reasonable about them and to come to reasonable judgments about them. So we are in effect presenting a different model of the child to the child. The model of the reasonable child is different from the model of the emotional child or the violent child or the active child. In other words, in children's literature, ordinary children's literature or television, almost never do you see the reasonable child as the model of childhood. And yet we have to have such a model because children usually will not engage in a certain kind of behavior that we want them to engage in unless we show them a model of it first. And so the novel plays this kind of role. It also is a model to the child of how reasonable children talk about things together, how they conduct reasonable dialogues, how they listen to each other, how they respect one another, how they enter into the dialogue at the appropriate moment, or what they judge as the appropriate moment. There are many ethical characteristics of the dialogue that children are taught simply by participating in classroom discussion. But in any case, narrative is, I think, just about indispensable. Children don't want, particularly, they don't want a third-person narrator or an adult narrator. I think that for these purposes, the narrator can be in the first person and speak in the first person, and that gives an immediacy to the voice of the narrator, which a third-person narrator doesn't do. And that's what we're trying to achieve, is immediacy, intensity, identification. I was not aware when I did Harry Stottlemyre in 1969 that the portrait I was giving of Harry and his classmates was more than just a portrait of discrete individuals, of separate individuals, because there is, even in a book like Harry, a portrait also of a group interaction, of a community of interactive relationships. A community of inquiry is able to deal with the problems of the community, not just the problems of individuals, but the problems that they together share as a burden, by talking them out together, by helping each other try to understand what it is that's happening. And for example, Aristotle quite rightly says that all deliberation is inquiry. And I think, that sets the tone for what we're trying to do. We're trying to teach ethics as inquiry, to teach logic as inquiry, to teach aesthetics as inquiry. By inquiry meaning here self-corrective procedures where the children become engaged in these problematic experiences and try to help one another to understand what they are dealing with and how they can improve and transform the situation that they're dealing with.
The kinds of skills that one accrues in a classroom community of inquiry are different than the kinds of skills that one masters in a traditional classroom. For example, children learn to give reasons for what they think in a community of inquiry. And they're expected to give reasons. It's not just enough to cite an opinion. Furthermore, once they give that reason, they have to be ready to hear the responses of their peers. Very often we discover that our reasons are not good enough, and they're not strong enough to support the kinds of things that we're advocating. Children also need to learn how to make judgments, and again to cite criteria, which are a subclass of reasons, for those judgments. If I tell you that I think a movie is good, or a book is good, or a certain person is good, I am responsible for telling you why I think it's good. And in that telling you why, I'm citing criteria for the judgment that I'm making. Whether the child is conscious of it or not, the teachers should be very cognizant of the fact that as children participate in such a community, they will undergo personal and hopefully an ethical transformation of the self. One of the most striking characteristics that seems to affect participants in such a community is that as time goes on, they find themselves saying things that they can't even believe that they're saying. For example, consider children around grade 6 or 7, what we call middle school age, and think about what it would be to hear a child saying this to a friend or to herself. 1, you know, Mom, I think I can tolerate ambiguity much more than I did last year. Or, you know, I find that I'm no longer pressured into accepting views that I somehow suspect are not well justified. I seem to be able to talk with my peers about what I think and not just do what they want me to do to belong to the crowd. Or thirdly, you know, I realize that I no longer feel a need to pretend what I think or I feel when I'm talking to my friends and to my parents. Or You know, I find that my tastes are changing. Things that I thought were so important last year are not so important this year. And things that I thought that I'd never be interested in, all of a sudden I find out that I'm very, very interested in. Or, you know, I find myself listening more these days rather than speaking. It must be that I am conscious that I need to hear different perspectives. Or, you know, once I was very certain about a lot of things, and I held my views very dogmatically, or very absolutely. Now, I tend to be much more tentative about what I think, and sometimes even about what I feel. You know, I think the longer I'm in this community, the more I've come to develop an appreciation for non-sloppy thinking. When I first came to this classroom, I really didn't care how people thought. Now, when I find people contradicting each other, or when I find people just airing their views and giving no reasons for their views, or when I find somebody who seems incapable of self-correcting, there's almost a visceral reaction, and I realize that I just don't like that kind of sloppy thinking anymore. It would seem to me that children who are exposed to a community of inquiry for their elementary education would be children who had a certain disposition to act on the world rather than to passively exist in the world. Children who know how to actively inquire usually develop into people who want to change the world in such a way that the norms and the standards that they believe in could become a living reality in the world as we experience it.
Any discipline that has subjects where there are concepts, important concepts, that the children need to absorb, where they have to be careful and interested. Any such discipline can use the community of inquiry format. You might think that mathematics would be an exception, but it isn't. There are a number of researchers who have done excellent work showing how children as early as kindergarten can learn mathematical concepts better if they can invent them for themselves and discuss them among themselves than if they simply are in a didactic classroom situation and are told what these concepts are by the teacher. In Quebec, too, there has been some pioneering work by professors of mathematics and professors of philosophy and of elementary education to work out narratives for small children, learning philosophy, learning mathematics using this childhood community of inquiry format.
You can't study any other discipline without studying some philosophy. The problem is that very often we don't even know that there's a philosophical dimension to other disciplines. Take, for example, mathematics. In mathematics, we're told that we're going to work with numbers. But what is a number? And how do you differentiate a number from a numeral? In social studies, we're supposed to study about democracy and justice and freedom. But what do those terms mean? And what have been the various views that have come down to us through the history of thought about these concepts that seem to be so important to a discipline like social studies or history? In language arts, very often we're very concerned with meaning. But what do we mean by meaning? And how does one go about finding meaning in stories, in literature, in videos, and in movies? In art, we're told that harmony and balance and unity are important criteria for producing good works of art. But what do they mean? And how do I know when I've achieved it? As I think of the various disciplines, especially science, where so many philosophical concepts play a central role, like cause and effect, description, explanation, habit, laws, principles. And when I realize how many children have no idea what these concepts mean, or are they even aware how controversial they are, and the difference it would make if one assumes one definition rather than the other in engaging in the scientific pursuit, you begin to realize how shallow the education in the disciplines is at the elementary school level, because children have been denied the opportunity to explore the philosophical dimension of each of these other disciplines.
Well, what is different about a philosophical dialogue is usually the topic that is under discussion, because people generally are engaged in non-philosophical discussions about specific topics that they understand well because they are clearly defined issues and they feel they know what they're talking about. In the case of philosophy, the topics that they deal with, concepts like truth and justice and beauty and goodness, are badly defined. No one knows how to define them well, and as a result, nobody really knows much about these areas, yet people enjoy talking philosophically because these issues are important. Justice is an important consideration in our lives. Truth is an important consideration. And we try to investigate and explore these concepts by philosophical dialogue. There really doesn't seem to be any other alternative to how to deal with them. Now you may say, well, but little children don't need philosophical subjects. Well, but see, we hold them responsible for knowing even though they don't know and we don't know. I'm thinking, for example, of a topic, a concept like truth. We expect children to tell the truth. We expect children to know the truth, the difference between truth and falsehood. We can't explain to the students what the difference between truth and falsehood ultimately is, but that's all right. We expect them to understand and to be able to talk about it if necessary. We expect them to understand that answers on tests should be true and not false, or correct and not incorrect. But nobody discusses the truth. There's no time out for a half-hour discussion of truth in our classes, whether at the elementary level or at the university level. It's something that's taken for granted, and it's something that needs to be discussed so that children have more security when they are asked about whether something is true or not. They have to be able to explore the issues, the considerations that that we take for granted, but that anybody dealing with truth has to be aware of. I know that it's difficult for teachers to teach a subject in which the concepts are poorly defined, the way philosophical concepts are. But that's better than nothing. The children are grateful for whatever little bits of understanding they can get. And this is one of the reasons why the community of inquiry develops, in order that students may pool their understanding rather than have it just siphoned off and disappear when they're trying to get started investigating it. Children working together, listening to each other, imitating each other, supporting one another. Children can often make progress in inquiry as well as an adult, or as several adults. I mean, their cooperativeness pays off in the methods that they use. The community of inquiry is almost like a single person thinking. That is to say, one child will ask a question. It may be that asking questions hasn't been prevalent in that classroom before, and that will be something of a surprise. But a child will ask a question, and immediately every child in the class, every other child, says to herself or himself, well, if he could raise a question, I can raise a question too. If he can raise a question, I can answer it. If he can ask a question, then the rest of us can discuss these matters among ourselves. It's not forbidden. It's not useless.
In a traditional school of education, answers are very important. In a classroom community of inquiry, questions are very important. And errors are very important, because when we make an error, we have a chance to see how we went wrong and to self-correct. And very often out of that kind of inquiry comes a new way of looking at things in general.
Children discover, one classroom after the next, one country after the next, that the community of inquiry provides a pedagogy which is of, I think, unparalleled power to get children talking, and by virtue of their talking, to get them thinking. And we know that they're thinking when we hear them offer opinions on what is being discussed, because if they offer opinions, then they bring up controversial matters. And then you really have a wonderful opportunity for the children to engage in good, solid, critical thinking, because whoever says anything, offers an opinion, that's a judgment, and a judgment generally requires a reason to support it. And this is where reasoning comes in, when children realize that they can't get away with reckless statements, that they've got to have solid reasoning to back up their opinions. So it's a change in the whole climate of the education in the school if the classroom is converted into a community of inquiry. I had been saying a minute ago that we need to engage in controversies in order that children should come out with reasons. And children need to bring up their reasons in order that we can press them to state their reasons for those opinions. And this is getting into the area of critical thinking. Now, critical thinking is one component of higher order thinking. It's a major component. At least it's not trivial. But if we can get them to engage in critical thinking, we can, in a sense, get them to think about their own thinking, to think carefully about their own thinking, to think correctively and critically about their own thinking, to think, we use the word in English normatively, but I'm not sure that that's the best term that we could have here. We want them to think evaluationally, that's a better term, to think judiciously about their own thinking, that may be a better term too. It's not just enough that we can get children to be more accurate in their thinking. Accuracy is important, but there are other things too. We don't want inaccuracy. We don't want children encouraged to make mistakes all the time. Critical thinking can get them to go over their thinking, to check it, to see what errors or mistakes or fallacies they might have fallen into. But there are, I would say, two other major components of higher order thinking. In addition to critical thinking, which critical thinking aims not only to be logical, but to be truthful. In addition to critical thinking, there's creative thinking. Now, creative thinking doesn't aim at truth except in some kind of metaphorical way, some kind of figurative way. If art is truth, figuratively speaking, yes, then creative thinking is important for that reason. But we want children, in addition to being careful and critical, we want them to be imaginative and creative. And this is the sort of thing that all of us do when we are trying to find the means to given ends, or more, we have to be creative when we're trying to solve a problem and we know what the solution is, but we have to be imaginative in coming up with the path to the solution. But we have to be imaginative too when we are trying to put parts together to form a whole, or when we are trying to see what unites one part of a work with another part of a work. It's not easy to know what to do to encourage creativity or to encourage imagination. But if there isn't that kind of atmosphere in the classroom, then the work of the children becomes dull and sluggish and mechanical and not at all the inspiring kind of thinking that creative thinking almost always is. But there's this third kind of thinking that's a component of higher order thinking, at least in the way I look at it, and that I call caring thinking. Without caring thinking, higher order thinking lacks a scale of values. It lacks a sense of the difference between what is important and what is unimportant. It lacks recognition that some things are morally right and some things are morally wrong. Some things we are obliged to do because we're under moral obligations, and some we are not. So there needs to be this third category of caring thinking, to round out the components of higher order thinking. Let me give you a couple of examples, because there are many different types of caring thinking, and I can't itemize them all. But let me give you an example. Take the case of art. There is a world of art, a public that is interested in art. And these consist, first of all, of the inventors of art, the composers of music, the sculptors who make sculptures. In other words, there is a creative component. Secondly, there are the people who evaluate art, the critics, and who try to be objective if they can. And thirdly, there is the public that appreciates art and doesn't appreciate what is lacking in artistic value. Now, that shows that for any given area, there will be an evaluative task, a critical task that the critics that the critics engage in. There will be an imaginative or creative component or group, and there will be the appreciators. We can say the same thing with, we don't have to go into this three-part arrangement, but we can consider that caring thinking is something we need to be dealing with when it comes to interpersonal relationships, emotional relationships. We don't want people who are uncaring, who have to deal with us as persons in bureaucracies or in big social organizations, or any kind of social organization. We don't want uncaring people who write the criticism. We don't want uncaring people who invent the art or music or whatever. We want people who have a set of values and who appreciate value or worth in what they encounter, who respect it. And this is where caring thinking has to be brought in, because without it, everything is dreary and mechanical. In the past 100 years, or 200 years, people have been exhorted to be rational. But then when they ask what rationality is, very often they were somewhat shocked to learn that rationality is thought of as a kind of self-interest, that a rational person is one who thinks first of himself or herself, organizes his life in a rather egotistical manner, and puts himself or herself first. This is very different from the person we describe when we talk about reasonable people. Reasonable people not only use reason and reasoning, but they listen to reason from others. They're ready to accept other people's reasoning if it is presented to them in the course of a discussion. So reasonable people is much more of a cooperative and socially acceptable form than I think rationality is. If we're going to try to develop democratic citizens, and we want to use the educational system to shape and mold the character of individual children so as to become strong citizens in a strong democracy, philosophy for children has, I think, much merit in that regard. One of the most important things that a citizen has to be able to do is to use judgment, to be not just decisive, make decisions, but to make just decisions, critical, creative, and caring decisions. And I think that philosophy for children is probably the only educational approach which is concerned to improve judgment. It seeks to improve judgment not only by trying to understand what makes a judgment suitable for a given situation. We have to make our children more judicious, more aware, more articulate, more understanding. We do not, we should not confuse understanding with knowledge. Many people have a lot of knowledge, but little understanding. Many people have understanding, but they can't translate it into applications to specific situations. And that requires judgment. So we have to go beyond just educating for knowledge, educating for facts, and think in terms of the discussion skills which will help children be more successful in their attempts to live in a century as complex as the one that we seem to be moving into. The child must be brought into the educational process. The child must begin to appreciate the educational experience as an experience, just as play is an experience, just as work is an experience, just as family and love are experiences. So education is an experience to be cherished and desired, because it's something precious and it's something very stimulating when it is done right. That means that there has to be new relationships developed between teachers and children, more cooperative relationships, more working relationships, more caring relationships than we have seen in the past. We have to make children flexible in their knowledge, flexible in their skills, flexible in their judgment, so that they can deal with the many different pressures and problems that they will be called upon to face in their lives in the century ahead. This cannot be done simply by warming over the curriculum of last year, over 100 years ago.
It seems to me that we also have the responsibility to prepare teachers in such a way that they can foster among children a global consciousness. And what I mean by that is a sense of how they, as individuals, relate to the whole, all of the people on the planet. This global consciousness also involves an ethical awareness of our relationship, not just to other people, but also to nature itself, how we should care for nature, and how our caring will be instrumental in the survival of the planet. When I talk about the reform of teacher education, what I'm implying is that from the very first year that the student enters into the university, he or she should be immersed in communities of inquiry where they learn how to think together, to work together, and to construct knowledge together. We can't expect teachers to be able to foster something that they themselves have never experienced. There's a sense in which their entire education should be immersion into and fostering of the perfection of participation in classroom communities of inquiry. Right. Now you can say, well, what does that mean in the concrete? Well, if you were to go into a traditional school of education today, my hunch is that you would see many professors lecturing to students about how to teach. If you were to go into a school of education that had decided to change its paradigm, you would see people, both teachers and students, immersed in intellectual inquiry about matters that they felt were important to the educational process. In 1992, some teachers asked me if I could write a letter to them giving them some advice on how to teach philosophy to elementary school children. They were not total novices. They had been through a training program in philosophy for children. Yet as they began to teach in their own classrooms, they were afraid. They were afraid that maybe they wouldn't be, quote, really doing philosophy. Secondly, they were afraid that perhaps they would, without being fully conscious of it, be indoctrinating children. And thirdly, they were really not quite sure of how to proceed. Now you have to remember that these teachers were teachers who have been brought up in traditional schools of education where the teacher was kind of a fount of knowledge, somebody who supposedly knew all the answers. She knew from her training program that philosophical issues are not the kinds of things that we have definite answers to. We had tried to explain to teachers that a philosophical concept is what we call the 3 C's. It has to be common to all children's experience. It has to be central or important to their experience. But most importantly, it has to be controversial. It has to be the kind of concept that children need to share views about before they can come to gain a clear understanding of what that concept means for them. Such philosophical concepts are friendship or mind or what it is to be a person or what do we mean when we say the word love or what do we mean when we say the word good. To be a good teacher of philosophy, one has to know how to listen. It's not so much recounting what you know, but rather listening to the opinions of the children and trying to remember for yourself how these opinions, in many instances, reconstruct the history of philosophy as you have mastered it for yourself. Secondly, it seems to me that you have to be a person who is willing to inquire with children. They have to see you as somebody who they have to see you as somebody who doesn't think that she knows all the answers, and that this process of inquiry that we're about to commence can make as much difference for her as it can for you in coming to some deeper understanding of, let's say, a concept like mind or children's rights or what we mean by justice. The students also need to see you as a person who loves ideas, who has allowed herself to immerse herself in the philosophical conversation that's taken place for 2,500 years, and now wants to invite you into that philosophical conversation. Teachers have to learn how to take what children say very seriously. And yet at the same time to demand a kind of logical rigor in the process of communal inquiry, so that the children, whether they realize it or not, are coming to master certain ways of proceeding. For example, learning how to give reasons, learning how to give counterexamples, learning how to make good inferences, learning how to question, learning how to present alternative views in a non-threatening manner. These are all important moves that one learns the longer one participates in a community of inquiry. Teachers, in time, come to realize the teaching of philosophy is like opening up a world, not just for the children, but for themselves. It's an elementary school discipline that seems to be as full of wonder and full of meaning for an adult as it is for any child. And that makes it very different from other disciplines that elementary school teachers teach in the classroom. After 22 years now of teaching, I can still say that I find the teaching of philosophy in an elementary classroom vital, meaningful, and lots of fun. That lots of fun is very important. I can't imagine a teacher not having fun in a community of inquiry at least a couple of times a day. Why? Because teachers should find themselves enjoying the inquiry as much as the students. And they should, in a relatively short time, begin to see a difference in how they themselves go about their everyday lives and their everyday worlds. They should begin to realize that there's a sense in which they haven't stopped growing, that they can continue to grow, and they can continue to look at these concepts that seem to form the basis of our daily experience, like self, language, meaning, freedom, and reconstruct what they mean for us in our daily experience as we listen to the children of the world and what they think. Very often teachers find it difficult to come to accept that the role of the teacher in a community of inquiry changes with time. In the beginning, it's very important that he or she be able to model all the moves of good inquiry. So if you were to visit a classroom, in the beginning of the year, you might find the teacher talking a great deal. Notice, however, that she's not talking substantively. Her remarks tend to be procedural in nature. She's asking for clarification, or she's offering a counterexample, or she's asking other people what they think, or she's asking for reasons, or she's asking for alternative points of view. However, it would seem to me that within a couple of months, her need to do that kind of procedural prompting should disappear, And the children should internalize the moves for themselves so that they're asking each other for reasons. They're asking each other for assumptions. They're identifying assumptions of each other's remarks and bringing them to the table for further inquiry. If you want to prepare children to take part in a strong democracy, it would seem to me that this kind of internalization of excellent thinking has got to take place at the very young, formative ages of our educational process. One way is to ask yourself, what are you trying to do? If one of the central traits of a community of inquiry is learning how to self-correct, that implies that we become conscious of criteria or norms by which we can self-correct. Criteria of a good functioning community of inquiry should be discussed and made available to the students as well as to the teachers, so that the locus of evaluation moves from administrators to teachers to the children themselves. What I'm saying is that ultimately children should be able to evaluate their own sessions by telling you how they have progressed from the last evaluation and making clear the criteria that they're using in making the judgments of evaluation about themselves. For example, students are very capable of evaluating two sets of tapes, one that was taken at the beginning of the school year and let's say one that's taken in the middle of the school year. And they might say, look how in the middle of the school year we're asking each other for reasons. Look how many of us are questioning the assumptions of others. Look how many of us are offering alternative points of view. Look how some of us are making creative leaps in the dialogue that we never made in the beginning. Look how there seems to be an atmosphere of trust in the classroom, where some of us are even trying out ideas that we're not even sure of ourselves, and yet we all understand that because we just want to see where the idea would go and what the consequences of that idea would be. This kind of evaluation, it seems to me, is congruent with the central aims of the community of inquiry. Well, in a society where education is valued, one would hope that educators would be able to put pressure on the government to put more and more of their money into the education of future generations than into other expenses like military expenses. However, we might find ourselves in situations time and time again where nothing can be done about having 50 children in a classroom. Does that mean that a community of inquiry is impossible? And the answer is no. It certainly is far more difficult. We're going to have to play different roles as we proceed. But it has been my experience that it is not impossible. If the children really believe that you are willing to inquire about philosophical concepts and are willing to take what they have to say very seriously, even in a class of 50 or 60 students, one can find authentic communal inquiry going on. Teachers are also concerned that very often the materials that have been developed by the Institute for the Advancement of Philosophy for Children are not appropriate for the situations in which they find themselves. They're either too long, or perhaps they do not relate to the life experiences of the children with whom they're working. And very often teachers ask me, well, can we use other things? And the answer is yes, of course you can use other things. There are short movies, there are short videos, there are stories of all sorts of kinds that would be appropriate. The materials that have been created by the IEPC have, in a sense, put the philosophical concepts and the philosophical procedures right on the surface of the stories, so that you almost have to be blind not to see what's going on. That's not the case in children's literature. Very often it's full of philosophical concepts and has the potential to initiate wonderful philosophical dialogue. But the onus of responsibility in that case is going to fall very much on the teacher. She's going to have to be able to identify those concepts for herself and be able to construct discussion plans and exercises that would initiate the kind of dialogue that would be appropriate for the age of the children. Constructing those kinds of discussion plans and exercises is not something that can be learned in a year or two. It takes many years to A, understand the philosophical conversation that has taken place in the West, B, to be able to compare that conversation with views of the East and views of non-traditional societies like in Africa, and thirdly, to be able to appropriate it in such a way that you can relate it to children's experience and to the things that they find puzzling and wondering in their own lives. We have a saying at the Institute that one has to be pedagogically strong but philosophically self-correcting. That is, that the children have to realize that the teacher is somebody who knows what she's doing, and that if they will only give her the benefit of the doubt in the beginning, they might find themselves in inquiry that can be very meaningful and open up a whole other dimension of their life. But in order for this to happen, the children have to be able to trust her. They have to feel that she can respect them as persons and as potential thinkers and even potential philosophers. If that's in place, it seems to me that 50% of the work is already done. And the rest has to be done by the group themselves. They have to evolve for themselves rules and procedures of dialogue that make sense for them. Certainly, if we all talk at one time, nobody can hear anybody else. On the other hand, who should talk when and how we should proceed in letting this one rather than that one talk is something that the group just has to work out for itself as communal inquiry proceeds. If you can speak at the age of 3, then you're more than capable of doing philosophy if you find yourself among adults and children who are willing to engage in the inquiry with you. Think of a child of 3. Think of the things that are important in her daily life and of the words that she uses as she goes through her day. Her mother expects her to get up on time. She expects her to be a good girl. Her brothers and sisters go to school. When she asks why they go to school, she's told that they go there to get an education. All of these concepts, time, good, education, are concepts that need exploration in order for a 3-year-old to make some kind of sense of her world.
Philosophy for children does not represent knowledge. It represents inquisitiveness, curiosity, creativity, imagination. It represents a mass of questions on all different sorts of subjects that children can become more and more intrigued by, and teachers too.